Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week I am sharing a conversation that I had with author William Bill Taubman on his and his brother Philip Taubman's most recent release, McNamara at War, A New History, about the life of John McNamara. Bill is a Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Khrushchev, The Man and His Era, and Gorbachev, His Life and Times, and a political science professor at Amherst College. McNamara at War is a new look at the life and legacy of John McNamara with new material pertaining to McNamara's internal war. I absolutely loved reading this book, and I am so excited to share this conversation with you guys today. So with that, let's get right into the conversation. Welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am joined today by Bill Taubman, and we are going to be talking about his most recent release, McNamara at War. Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about how this book came to be?
Yes, well, I co-wrote the book with my brother, Phil, who's a journalist. I'm an academic. He was approached more than 10 years ago by a Stanford professor, David Kennedy, who in turn had been approached by an old McNamara friend at the Pentagon, Alan Enthoven, who in turn had been approached by Diana McNamara, who was McNamara's second wife and widow, and she had a collection of documents which McNamara had left to her in her care, and she thought they might add up to a new book. So Kennedy asked Phil if he would be interested in writing a new book, and he thought about it. He looked at the documents. He agreed they would indeed constitute a book, but he was busy finishing another book, a biography of George P. Shultz, the Reagan Secretary of State. So he postponed it. Then he went again and looked at it, and he decided he would like to do it, and he asked me if I would do it with him. My field is Russian studies, and I've written biographies of Nikita Khrushchev and Mikhail Gorbachev. So the question is, why did I want to do a book about an American leader? And the answer is I'd run out of Russian leaders I wanted to write about, except perhaps for Vladimir Putin. But if I had started to work on him, I might have ended up in a ditch. So that's how it began.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed listening to this book and reading it. I did a little bit of both as I was going through it. I really enjoyed the way that it was written with a lot of callbacks to McNamara's own, like his memoirs and, things that other people had said about him. I really liked how that was integrated in there. So you had all this new material for this book. How did the research and writing process go for this one?
Well, an absolutely key development which allowed this book to take the shape it did was when the widow, Diana, told me about a historian, American historian at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, who had set out to write a biography of McNamara in the 80s, but ended up helping McNamara write his own memoirs. And according to Diana, this fellow, Brian Vandermark, had more than 2,000 pages of transcripts of interviews he had done with people from throughout McNamara's life, beginning in high school, college, Harvard Business School, all the way through. So I went down to see him in Annapolis, and he agreed kindly to share the transcripts. So suddenly we had interviews from throughout the life of the man we wanted to write a biography of.
That's amazing. And I do think those interviews, they really, helped shape the story of his life. They really added something that you don't get too often with people from the past, all those different perspectives on them.
Yes, it really created an outline for the book, because suddenly I realized as I looked at it that there ought to be a chapter on his childhood. There ought to be one on his years at Berkeley. There ought to be one on Harvard Business School, his time in the military, Ford Motor Company, all of this. And I thought this was important, not just because the documents were there, but because I thought looking at his life from the beginning would show us evolving him evolving into the man that he became, which was, of course, the heart of the book.
I like reading about like his early life and his time in college and some of the like just the way his personality was and how that kind of led to what happened during the Vietnam War and his decision making and how it all kind of stemmed from how he was as a young adult and as he went on through his career.
Yes, you had to explain how this guy could rise to the very top of the American establishment, the American government, why he could be put in charge of the Vietnam War, and why he could turn out to live a double life. That is to say, as a proponent of the war within the councils of the White House, and as a secret opponent of the war, while remaining in charge of the war.
Yes, he was definitely a duality there within his personality. Do you want to start talking about McNamara? Do you want to start at the beginning of McNamara's life?
Well, I think his parents were crucial. I guess parents almost always are, but his were particularly interesting because the father was kind of cold and aloof and distant, much older, 20 years older than his wife. McNamara's mother was just the opposite, passionate, intense, determined that her son become a star at whatever he did. And yet at the same time, kind of carrying out what I thought of as petty tutelage. I mean, imagine this brilliant young man at Harvard Business School, number one in his class, admired by his fellow students and his professors. And he's getting letters from his mother telling him, don't forget to wear an overcoat because it's cold in Cambridge. Don't forget to brush your teeth, things like that. So simultaneously, she's pushing him, propelling him upward, and infantilizing him in another sense. And I think all of this created a kind of, or helped to create a kind of confusion in his mind as to exactly who he was. You can do you can do worse than describe him as combining qualities of his father and his mother. That is, on the one hand, seeming cold, aloof, arrogant, like his father, and on the other hand, pushing, pushing, pushing for ever higher status as his mother had demanded.
Yes, especially during those college years, she had like let the leash out, but she still kept a hold of it just a little bit.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine, but he was a member of a fraternity, and she was a member of the Mothers Committee of the fraternity.
When I read that, I was like, I didn't even know that that existed, that kind of thing with fraternity. It's like a mother's group of the fraternity. I thought that was interesting.
There's one other aspect of his mother that I think is relevant. She not only pushed him to excel, that is, to do well, she also pushed him to do good. That is, she instilled in him kind of highest standards of personal rectitude, to be honest, to be honest as he climbed the ladder. And I think that showed during the Vietnam War, because when his conscience began to bother him about all the killing that was going on in Vietnam, and he reached the conclusion that the war was unwinnable and that the U.S. should get out of Vietnam. I think there were echoes in this of his mother's constantly reminding him to do the right thing, to be a Boy Scout or an Eagle Scout.
Reading about the time during Vietnam when he was really, going like this is an unwinnable war, this is something that we really need to get out of, but still working towards continuing the war with Johnson. Before we get to that part, did you want to talk about any of his time, his own military experience, or his time at the Ford Motor Company?
Well, one thing I observed tracking his life from the beginning up through the Ford Motor Company and the Defense Department was that in the beginning, he reached out and tried to help people who weren't as bright as he was, to sort of identify kids who needed extra help from somebody like him. But as the years go by, you sense that he's less interested in helping other people, that he's getting a kind of inflated sense of his own superiority, and as if that becomes the primary thing that he's interested in, promoting himself. And during World War II, he is recruited by the Defense Department to become a kind of statistician with a mandate to make sure the U.S. Air Force, or the Army Air Corps, as it was then called, functioned efficiently. And that brought him up to the point where he worked with General Curtis LeMay to plan the firebombing of Tokyo, which which killed about 100,000, mostly innocent Japanese. And I think that for the rest of his life bothered him. As he said, it made him into a war criminal in effect. And that kind of sense of guilt was reawakened and deepened during the Vietnam War.
And even as like we get into the Vietnam War, I remember reading about Johnson having kind of his own guilty conscience about some of the decisions that he was making, or how he didn't want to be the one to like make those hard decisions, and how like he had his good days and his bad days, and when the bad days were there, they were really bad days. And it seems like they are competing guilty consciences.
Yes, in fact, one of the things that I figured out in the course of working on the book was that there was a kind of vicious circle of feedback between Johnson and McNamara. They both began doubting that the war could actually be won. I have written down, if I can find it, something that Johnson said. Actually, I am not finding it, but essentially what Johnson said was, wait a minute, I think I can find it. Yeah. In 1964, talking to Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, Johnson said, "Damn worst mess I ever saw," that is Vietnam. "Don't see how we're ever going to get out. I just don't know what to do." Now, McNamara had a version of that too, because just before Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, he and McNamara decided that the United States should begin to pull military advisors out of Vietnam. And Kennedy seemed determined, if he was reelected, to actually do that. So here you have these two guys, each of them not sure what the hell to do with Vietnam. Kennedy dies, Johnson's president, and his advisors conclude that despite his doubts, he wants to fight and win the war in Vietnam. Now, what does McNamara do when he realizes this? He falls into his lifelong mode of making the best possible case for what his boss wants. And so we learn from people in that circle, one of them, Clark Clifford, who later succeeds McNamara as Secretary of Defense, that McNamara makes the most extreme case for staying and fighting in Vietnam than any of Johnson's advisors. Now, what happens then? Johnson hears this extreme case and adopts it as his own. And he is now making an extreme case for fighting and winning in Vietnam. And what's the effect of that on McNamara? McNamara is even more convinced now that he must make that case. So he makes it even more strongly, and that convinces Johnson. So they're convincing each other back and forth that this war must be fought and won. And yet, despite that, 3 or 4 months later, McNamara comes to the conclusion that the war cannot be won, that it's militarily unwinnable. And that creates a terrible dilemma for him. What is he supposed to do, believing that the war is unwinnable and simultaneously being in charge of that war?
I definitely don't ever wish that upon anybody, having to be in that kind of situation, having to decide, what to do with all of these, all the young men that are being drafted for this war that are going over. Many, many people died in the Vietnam War, and it had like it still has a lasting effect on like the cultural zeitgeist. Like it's still very prevalent in our everyday life, and it's just something that I can't imagine having to make those decisions, knowing that it's unwinnable, but still putting people over there or sending people over.
Well, what happened much later in the 90s when McNamara finally gets around to writing his memoirs, And he says in the introduction, he says about Vietnam, we were wrong. We were terribly wrong. And what happens? That is greeted by caustic, nasty reaction from people who say, my God, this guy sent American boys and girls, mostly boys, I'm afraid, to die in a war that in which McNamara no longer believed. How evil is that? Now, McNamara, I think, was torn and it showed. I mean, he was tormented later in life. He considered himself guilty. There are two occasions I can mention that both happened in the 80s or 90s. One of them, he was speaking at a conference at Brown University, and a Vietnam veteran in the audience stood up, walked forward, pointed at McNamara, and said, "You're a son of a bitch." And what did McNamara say in reply? He said, "I am a son of a bitch." And the other incident was in 2002 when McNamara was in Cuba at a conference. He's at a conference in Cuba in 2002, and Fidel Castro, still president of Cuba, says, "We're going to have another conference in 10 years, and you must come back." And McNamara says, "I can't come back because in 10 years I will be in hell." So there, and I'll add one other thing that we learned from the widow and from McNamara's son, Craig McNamara. They both report that McNamara, toward the end of his life, considered suicide, but didn't do it because he didn't want the stigma of his suicide to be attached to his family. So this is a tragic story of a brilliant man who masters everything he touches in life until the Vietnam War masters him.
The story of the Vietnam War is just I when I was in college I took a class that was on 20th century US history. We spent quite a bit of time on the Vietnam War, and I had to read this book called The Working Class War, and how it was mostly poorer working class men that were being sent off to Vietnam, and how it just impacted that sector of society. So I've always had that in the back of my mind, especially when reading this and having that perspective of the people who were sent over there, but also the people who are here in the office making the decisions and having to decide who goes and who doesn't go. So I've always kind of had that in the back of my mind, especially when I was reading this book. I was thinking about that book on my shelf that I read 5-6 years ago now, but it's always been one that has stayed with me about the Vietnam War.
One thing that was fascinating to me throughout the project of working on this book is how much of McNamara's activities and his thoughts about what he was doing, how much was unique to him, as opposed to all the other people who worked with him, like McGeorge Bundy, the National Security Advisor, and the other people in the White House, like Kennedy and Johnson. And you can make the case, and I consider this a serious case, that they were all influenced by Cold War thinking, by the domino theory. One of the things that McNamara said at one point was that if we lose South Vietnam to the communists, then we lose all of Southeast Asia. If we lose all of Southeast Asia, then we lose Japan and India. If we lose Japan and India, then the virus spreads to Greece and Turkey and even Africa. I mean, this is an incredible domino theory. And in one or another version, they all believe this. So that's to say McNamara was not unique. But McNamara was unique because he was the one who was tormented by guilt, eventually allowed that to ruin his life. And I have a proof of that because at one point later in his life, McGeorge Bundy was at a cocktail party or a dinner party in Cambridge at Harvard, and some inebriated young man pressed him, and he said, "Mr. Bundy, isn't it true that you," I hope you don't mind my four-letter word here,
No, you're good.
isn't it true that you fucked up in Vietnam? And Bundy said, yes, I did fuck up in Vietnam, but I'm not going to let it ruin the rest of my life. And there it is. There's McNamara's uniqueness. He did let it ruin the rest of his life. So there you have the domino theory that everybody shares and the uniqueness of McNamara's psychology.
And McNamara lived a long time. He was 93 when he passed away.
Yes, in 2009. Yes.
So he lived a long time, having experienced this in the 60s and the 70s, and he died in the 2000, I can't remember
Nine.
the year, 2009. That's a long time to have that in your own in your conscience. And I mean,
Yes.
after he worked after the Secretary of Defense, when he was working at the World Bank,
Yes.
I think it was more of a trying to maybe not rectify, but try to put some good in after he had done some bad.
Yes, that's the way he saw it. The World Bank was useful to him in many ways. And one way was that, in effect, it constituted a kind of repentance because now he was trying to help the poorest of the poor in the world to have a slightly better life, as opposed to sending innocent soldiers off to die in a war in which he did not believe. But the World Bank was also useful because one of its rules is that people who work at the World Bank are not supposed to talk about the politics of the country from which they came. And that was especially true of the president of the World Bank, namely McNamara. So suddenly, McNamara is barred by the rules of the World Bank from talking about Vietnam. And the point is, he didn't want to talk about Vietnam anyway. And Johnson didn't want him to talk about Vietnam. So suddenly he was required to do what he wanted to do anyway, which was keep his mouth shut.
I think I'd like to talk about McNamara's place in history. In my own schooling, most of what we learned about McNamara is about that time between Kennedy and Johnson, and then after that, he's not really spoken about again in like high school history or even college history. So what I knew about him before going into this book was mostly just his time in those two administrations. But I am just looking for maybe your perspective on how, like, as we move forward, what McNamara's place will be in history, like as we are able to look back more on his life as he becomes more of the just a historical figure rather than somebody that was still currently living. If that makes any sense.
Yes, well, I'd say a couple of things. Every day we read in the newspaper about big officials in Washington and elsewhere, and we have some clues as to what their inner thoughts might be, but we really don't know. And often one of their main tasks is to hide their inner thoughts, especially if they disagree with their boss. Now, I think one of the fascinating things about McNamara as a historical figure is we can see the inner thoughts of this man. Uh, if not at the time when they were hidden, then much later as he reworks and rethinks and goes over his own life. So I think in that sense, it's a very rare instance in which we can see the suffering in McNamara's case that he's going through. Now, that suffering probably does not excuse all the mistakes he makes, all the. At one point, he says when he's working on his memoirs, and we have the transcript of those discussions with his editor, he says, "I've killed thousands, tens of thousands of people, and I owe them an explanation of what I've done." Now, how many officials go around thinking that way? And even if they do, how many admit to thinking that way? Another thing about McNamara is that after his time at the World Bank, one of the things he did was embark on two oral history conferences or sets of conferences. one about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the other about Vietnam itself. And in these conferences, people gathered who had been in the government, scholars, they had documents, they went over these cases, trying to explain what had happened. And these are fascinating results, which are published in a series of books about both Cuba and Vietnam. And in Cuba, what they learned at these conferences, what was unknown until then, was that the Russians had battlefield nuclear weapons in Cuba. And if the United States had invaded Cuba to get rid of the Soviet missiles, the Russians might very well have used those nuclear weapons to blow up the Marines landing on Cuba's beaches. And if that had happened, where would that have led? One possibility is a nuclear war. And in Vietnam, McNamara went to Hanoi twice for these conferences and tried to get the Vietnamese to explain why it was that they had not responded to the peace feelers which he had gotten Johnson to carry out, because they had not. McNamara kept trying to produce negotiations. And McNamara, kept saying, "Why didn't you believe us when we asked for negotiations?" And the Vietnamese would say, "Because we knew you wanted to destroy us." So again, this kind of post-mortem insight into these conflicts, led by a man like McNamara, who was central to the conflicts at the time that they occurred. This was an extra contribution of McNamara later on, after the battle was over.
It definitely does feel rare for this kind of reflection to have happened, especially from someone who's so intimately involved in all of it. As someone who reads history and looks back at our history, I like being able to see how it happened and then his reflection on it in the past, kind of contextualizing how that happened in his what he was thinking then, and then how he's thinking about it now, and how things come up like the Cuban missiles, like how that was something that was not known. When I heard that, I was like, oh my gosh, that, because the Cuban Missile Crisis is its own thing. And I was like, well, I'm glad we did not decide to invade Cuba that time, because that would have been mutually assured destruction and all of that part of the nuclear war piece of it.
It was very close, because although in the end we neither bombed those missile sites nor invaded Cuba, we came very close. The American forces were poised in Florida to
Hmm.
attack, and we have Kennedy and Khrushchev to thank for pulling back from the edge. But one wonders these days whether Putin and Trump would ever pull back from the edge if they got to that point.
Yes, I'm in Florida, so the Cuban Missile Crisis is something that is talked about a lot throughout schooling. So it's something that they really talk to us about. So the Cuban Missile Crisis has been something I've learned about from when I was small to in college. It was a big part of it, just because of where I am.
We even have a description of McNamara at the moment at one of these conferences when a Soviet general reveals that they had these battlefield nuclear weapons. And he's described as, sitting at the table listening, and suddenly he freezes because he's never heard this before, and he realizes its potential for disaster. So again, it's the kind of internal life of a superhero turned supervillain. Very, very interesting.
Is there anything else you want to say about McNamara before we wrap up?
Well, I guess I want to say that I understand the case of people who tend to dismiss McNamara's doubts and his conscience and say, well, he's just putting on an act to evoke sympathy from people who are reading about how tormented he was. And I recently gave a talk at Amherst College, right here where I've taught all these years. And somebody in the audience made the case that McNamara was pretending to be tormented, just as he had pretended to believe that we should escalate in Vietnam, that he was totally cynical. And I listened to this, and I thought it was a very provocative thing to say. And I replied, if you read the book, if you read all the evidence about what he had to say, how he behaved, how he often wept at meetings, public and private, about his own role. Uh, it's hard to believe that this was put on. I can't believe. I think it was real, and if it's real, it's pretty devastating too.
I also got the feeling that it was definitely real emotions that he was feeling, and because he lived such a long life, he was tortured by it for until the day he died. He was something that he went through, even in the descriptions of him going to the Vietnam Memorial, but like late at night, so that no one would see that he was there.
Yes.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed reading this book, listening to it. Where can people find this book?
Well, I would recommend their local bookstores, first of all. You can always go to Amazon if you can't find it at your local bookstore, but local bookstores are wonderful things. They make a big contribution to our country, and if you can support them by buying the book in a local bookstore, then the more power to you.
Yes, and I will say local bookstores will often take recommendations. So if it's not available at the moment, they can most definitely try to buy it for you, buy it for their stock so that you can purchase it through them so that we can support those local bookstores. And then is there anywhere that we can find you, or are you available on the internet anywhere?
Well, I do have a website. It's called williamtaubmanbooks.com. And as I mentioned earlier, I wrote a biography of Nikita Khrushchev,
Mhm.
which, if I can be immodest for a minute, won a Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Critics Circle Award for biography. And then I wrote a biography of Mikhail Gorbachev, which did not win a Pulitzer Prize, but was a pretty good book nonetheless. And I've written other books earlier in my life which were more academic, but these books I tried very hard to make them academic in the sense that they provide deep historical perspective, but also for the general reader, lively enough for somebody to enjoy reading. And just in case I didn't do that about McNamara, I had my brother, who's a New York Times journalist and had been an investigative reporter and has a nose for the news. And we had a great time working together. And I might say that if and when we quarreled, which we hardly ever did, I prevailed because I'm 6.5 years older. I had seniority.
Perfect.
That's a joke.
All right. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I really enjoyed reading this book, and I will definitely make sure to link your website and places to find the book in the description. And thank you again for coming on the show.
Well, thank you, Madison. I enjoyed talking to you. Lots of fun.
I want to thank Bill again for coming on the show and sharing this amazing book with us. I will be sure to link the book in the description below. I just want to reiterate how much I enjoyed this book. There is plenty more to read about McNamara that we didn't touch on in this conversation, so definitely look for this book. I mixed reading the physical copy and listening to the audiobook, and I can gladly recommend both versions. If you liked what you heard today, please leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you have any questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can email me at itsahistorypodcast@gmail.com. You can also find me on Instagram and Threads at It's a History Podcast. Thank you again for listening, and thank you again to Bill for today's episode.